Hey everyone, welcome back to week 4, part A. So to start with the next section, I want to briefly talk about this thing that I call the big four. So this is what I consider the big four pieces of programming. So these are 4 things that are sort of fundamental to any programming language that you may use. And we've already covered 3 of them at this point. So at this point we've already talked about variables, we've talked about functions, and we've talked about one type of loop, right? We've talked about 4 loops. So today we are going to talk about what I consider the 4th of the big 4, which is conditional statements. So let's go ahead and start talking about conditional statements. So the idea behind a conditional statement is maybe you want a section of your code to only happen in certain scenarios, right? If that's the case, then you are probably going to use something called a conditional statement in your code. So every conditional statement has a condition, and this condition is going to be some sort of expression that evaluates to a bool type. So that condition is either going to be something that's true or something that's false. And generally with conditional statements, the way it works is if the condition is true, then the code that is part of that block, that section of code that's linked with the conditional statement, then the code will run. If it's not true, code is just skipped over. So again, this is a way to sort of control your program flow. So this is a way again to make it so that code will only run in certain situations, in certain scenarios. If something is true, then run this code. Alright, so here's our first example, and this is something I would recommend actually going ahead and opening up a new file in idle and typing this out on your own. So this first line right here, this is an assignment statement. This is something that we're used to now, right? It's an input, user input, and it converts it to an integer. And then the second line, this is a conditional statement. So in Python, we start most conditional statements with an if. So if, this is one of these Python key terms, if some condition, and then a colon, and then any code that you only want to run if that condition is true, you then indent underneath the if. So this colon indent thing, it works the same as colon indents as, with function definitions and with for loops. Similar sort of idea. The code that is part of the conditional statement, basically the code that you only want to run in this specific scenario, is what you have indented after that colon. So again, you do if some condition, colon, and then code indented that you want to run. So in this example here, user inputs a number, some integer, Python converts it to an integer type, and then it checks to see if the mod of that number, when you mod it by 2, is equal to 1. Alright, so essentially this is checking to see if after you do the division with the number that you type in and 2, if there's 1 left over or not. If there is 1 left over, that means this condition is going to be true, which means this code will run. And as you can see here, it will basically print that the number is odd, which makes sense, right? If the mod of the number, mod 2, is 1, that means it's going to be an odd number, because if it were 0, it would be an even number, right? If 2 divided evenly into the number, it would be even. If it doesn't divide evenly, meaning there is 1 left over after that division, it's going to be an odd number. So again, any statements that you have indented under this if statement, this if condition colon, anything that's indented under that, that will only run if that condition is true, if num is odd. So again, this is one form of conditional statement. This is a simple if statement. Basically, if something is true, do this code. If that were not true, that print would just not happen. It would just skip over that code. So in general, this is what an if statement looks like. This is one type of conditional statement. You have if some condition that evaluates to either true or false, so it has to evaluate to a bool type, and then a colon, and then statements underneath it. And again, those statements are going to be indented, and these statements here will only run if that condition is true. If the condition is not true, those statements that are indented are going to be skipped. So this again, this is an if statement. This is one kind of conditional statement. Alright, so another option you have with conditional statements is to pair an if with an else. You can probably guess what this is going to do. So again, the else is optional, so you can have an if without an else. We just saw that on the previous example. But you can also do an if paired with an else. So this program here, if you want to go ahead and edit that file that you were working with for this example, this builds off of our previous example where you input a number, Python converts it to an integer. This first if right here, if condition, the condition here is checking to see if the number is odd. If it is, then it will print number is odd. And you can optionally pair an if with an else. So with the else, the way it works is basically if the if is false, meaning that code under the if doesn't get run, it will instead do the code that's under the else. So it's basically if this is true, then do this. Otherwise, do this other code. A couple things that I do want to point out about this. Again, the code that you want to be paired with the if is indented under that if. The if and the else, those are both lined up at the same indentation, and you only have a condition within the if, because the whole idea of an else is that it's sort of a catch-all. If the if isn't true, then you just do the else. So if condition colon some code, else colon some code. So here's the general form of a pair of if-else. So again, this is another type of conditional statement you can do. This is a pair if-else, they go together. So again, if some condition, this condition has to evaluate to either true or false, and then some statements under the if, and then else, colon, and then some statements under the else. So if and else, these are both Python keywords. Again, note the colons, note the indentation, note all that fun stuff. So again, in this sort of general scenario, if that condition is true, then the statements 1 will run, meaning the statements that are part of the if. If that condition is false, then statements 2, meaning the statements that are indented under the else, those will run instead. So again, it's sort of an either-or option. Alright, you have even more options. So again, conditional statements, we've talked about if, and we've talked about if paired with else. Now I'm going to talk about if paired with elif. This is E-L-I-F. You say that as elif. So elif is basically shorthand for else if. So in general, the way it works is you still have an if, and you have, some condition with it, colon, some statements under it. And then you can pair it with as many elifs as you want. So you can have one elif, two elifs, so on. You have to start with an if, and then you can have as many elifs as you want. And these elifs, the way you want to think of it in your head is, again, as an else if. So basically, it will run the first set of statements that match true for one of the conditions. So Python's going to go through these conditions here. It'll check first the condition with the if statement. If that condition is true, it will run the statements under the if, and then that's it. If it's false, it'll keep checking. So it would then check condition 2 with the elif. If that is true, then it'll run the statements 2, and then skip the rest of the elifs. So it's basically checking to see for the first condition that matches true. And again, you can have as many elif statements as you want. You just have to start it with an if. So if condition, do this stuff. Elif, some other condition, do this other stuff. Elif, some other condition, do this other stuff. And again, you can have as many of those elifs as you want. So that's another option, right? We got a lot of options with these conditional statements. You have the if, you have if else, and then you also have if elif. So those are 3 sort of possible scenarios you could be using them for. And we got one more. So this is a 4th scenario. So there's essentially 4 scenarios for conditional statements. Again, the first 3 are if by itself, an if paired with an else, And then you can also have an if paired with as many elifs as you want. This fourth condition sort of combines everything. So this is where you have an if, as many elifs as you want, and then an else at the very bottom. So it runs kind of how you'd expect. So again, it will run the first set of statements that match true for one of the conditions. So it's checking all the conditions first in the if, then in the elif, then in other potential elifs. If all of them end up being false though, by tacking an else onto it, that's sort of a catch-all situation. If none of these conditions match, it will run the statements under the else. So the difference between this one and this previous one does not have an else. So in this previous one, it's very possible that it won't run any of these statements. If they're all false, if all these conditions are false, it will just completely skip all of these statements. On this one, if all the conditions are false, it will do whatever's in the else. So again, you have some options. You might be thinking at this point, why are there so many? Well, it kind of just depends on what your code is going to do. So it's kind of up to the design of the programmer, how you're going to sort of control it. But I think it'll make a little bit more sense once we do a couple of examples. But again, conditional statements, you have four options. If by itself, if with an else, if with as many elifs as you want, or if with as many elifs as you want, finished with an else. Those are your four possible sets of conditional statements. Alright, so let's go ahead and work through this example together. So looking at this, first line of code, we have an assignment statement. The variable value gets 100, integer 100. Alright, cool. And then we hit an if, and we see that this if is paired with elifs, two elifs, and an else. So this whole thing, this if, this elif, this elif, this else, this is one set of conditional statements. It starts with the if and ends with the else. So as Python, you're going to run through it top down, and you're looking for the first condition that's going to be true. So we check this first one. If value is less than 50, value is 100, so that's false, right? So this first if, that's not true, so we skip that. Now we're going to check the condition in this first elif. Alright, so this condition in the elif is value greater than 50. That's true, right? Value is greater than 50 because it's 100. And, so this is using one of those Boolean comparisons, Boolean operators, right? And value mod 2 equals 1. Alright, so again, value mod 2 equals 1, that's checking basically to see if it's odd, right? Because it's checking to see if the remainder, if after dividing by 2 is 1. So it's checking to see if it's odd. And that's going to be false, right? Because value is 100, which is an even number. So this entire elif, because it's an and, we have elif true and false. This whole thing is going to be false. Alright, so the second condition is also not a match because this whole thing is false. Alright, cool. So we'll skip down to the next elif. Elif value greater than 90. That's true, right? 100 is greater than 90. There's no other condition there. So, because this is the first condition that we hit that is true, we're going to do the statements under this elif. So this will come out with just C. So again, we don't even hit the else because we hit a condition that was true. So again, the rules with if, elifs, and an else, you only go all the way down to the else if nothing was true up above. Alright, let's do another one. So go ahead and try this one out on your own. Go ahead and pause the video and come back once you have your answer. Alright, so with this one, we have a couple things going on. So with these sort of problems, you should first sort of identify where the conditional statements are, where the sets of them are, right? And again, there's a couple different types. I see right away that there's an if, this if value less than 50, so there's a conditional statement there, right? But then the next line of code starts with another if, right? So we have an if and then another if. So these two ifs, these are going to be two different sets of conditional statements. So these are going to be independent of each other. And this second if here, that second if is paired with an elif and an else. And then we have another if at the bottom. So we actually have three sets of conditional statements in this example. We have this first if by itself. We have this second if paired with the elif and the else. So that's another set, the if, elif, else. And then the third set of conditional statements is this if at the very bottom by itself. So when you're running through this code, you have to sort of treat those three different sets of conditional statements separately. So what I mean by that is, whether or not the conditions in other sets of conditional statements are true, it doesn't affect the other one. So running through this top down, value is 100, cool. We hit this first conditional statement. If value is less than 50, that's false, right? Value is not less than 50, so that first if, that condition is false, so we skip that. Cool, and then we hit the second if. So if value does not equal 100, that's false, because the value does equal 100. So the condition in this if is false, which means we're now going to check the condition in the elif. Value mod 2 equals 1. That's also false, right? Because 100, it's not odd. That mod is not going to be 1. So the condition in the elif is also false. So then we fall down to the else. So because value does not equal 100 and value mod 2 is not 1, the condition that we use in this set of conditional statements here with the if, the elif, and the else is going to be the one in that else. So we will print D, and then going down even further, we hit another completely separate conditional statement. If value is greater than 50, then go ahead and print E. Value is greater than 50, so I'm going to print E. So this one will print D and E. So again, when you're working with conditional statements, I know there's a lot of different sort of combinations. There's those 4 combinations that we talked about. If with an else, if with as many elifs as possible, or if with as many elifs as you want that ends with an else. But a key thing to keep in mind is that no matter what sort of set of conditional statements you're using, they all start with an if, right? Every single one of them starts with an if. And you can't have, ifs aren't going to be paired together. So if you have 2 ifs next to each other, those aren't going to be related to each other. So the start of a set of conditional statements is always going to be an if. And you want to treat each set of conditional statements separate from any other set of conditional statements within your code. That said, if you have any questions about this, do feel free to post on that discussion forum online or send me an email. I'm happy to help or clarify anything. Alright, one last thing I do want to mention about conditional statements. These are something that, like everything else that we've been working on, you can combine with other code. So what I mean by that is, for example, you could put a conditional statement inside of a function definition. You could put a conditional statement inside of a for loop. You can use all this code sort of get together. You can also even nest conditional statements, meaning you could put a conditional statement as part of the code from inside of another conditional statement, kind of like how nested for loops were, right? You have inner for loop, outer for loop. You can do the same thing with nested conditional statements. This can be useful to test more than one condition. So for whatever reason you don't want to use AND, you could use nested conditional statements instead. It does have a benefit over using AND, in that it can provide helpful feedback within the conditions. So using AND to sort of combine conditions, it works. But for example, if the condition isn't met, it won't tell you which part of the AND failed, if that makes sense. So if you use nested conditional statements, you could potentially have better feedback on that. So this is what I mean by nested conditional statements. Here's an example here. So this is working with this same example that we've been working with for this section. So if you want to go ahead and update that file to look like this, feel free to pause the video and take the time now to do that. That said, looking at this code, again, we have the same input statement here. Input a number, converts it to an integer. This first if num mod 2 equals 1, that's checking to see if it's odd, right? And then we have another if and an else inside of it. I'll talk about that in a second. But first thing I want to point out is this first if, that is matched with the else at the very bottom of this program. So you can check and see which if matches with which else based on the indentation levels. So this first if matches with the very bottom else because they're both indented at the same place. They're both, they're both not indented. So since those line up, this num mod 2 equals 1, that is paired with the else at the very bottom. Inside this if up here, this if num mod 2 equals 1, the code that will run if that is true is another set of an if and an else, which is this if num is less than 10, print num is odd and less than 10, else num is odd and at least 10. So again, the way these sort of work is if both of the conditions in these ifs are met, then this print statement here, num is odd and less than 10, then that will run. If, let's say for example, if num mod 2 equals 1, let's say that's true, but it's not the case that num is less than 10, then the code here in this else, specifically the print num is odd and at least 10, then that will run instead. I think this is best sort of explained by example though, so again I do recommend typing this up and running it in idle and just try it with a couple different numbers as inputs and just sort of see how the output comes out and try to take a guess to type in a number before you press enter. Take a guess as to what is going to be displayed on the screen after you press enter, then press enter and see if what you thought makes sense, if that's what came out. So here's a challenge for you. So go ahead and take the code that I just showed you on the previous slide and go ahead and edit it so that instead of just displaying that a number is even, you should output that it's even and whether or not it's less than or at least 30. And then also add some comments that help explain the code, because on the previous slide there were no comments at all. So again, we are working with this code here, and I basically want you to make another set of nested conditional statements, but this time they're going to be under this else at the bottom. So go ahead, pause this video, go ahead and edit this code, and when you are ready, feel free to unpause the video and come back. Alright, so I know this is a little long, but hopefully you took the time to write the code yourself, so this should look familiar. So here's a possible solution to what I just showed. Hopefully yours has better comments. As you can see, I'm running out of space on this slide for comments. But again, this is the idea of what nested conditional statements look like. And just make sure when you are reading the code, follow it top down. Remember the rules about how conditional statements work. And just go very methodically in order about it. That said, if you do have any questions about this example, again, feel free to post the discussion forums, send me an email. Please do let me know.